By the late 80s, affordable 16-bit computers had become standard. These computers were much better at playing games, and sometimes could offer a pretty good arcade experience in the comfort of your own home. This trend continued with game consoles in the 90s, often faithfully replicating the very same gaming experience from the arcades, and it was all thanks to a CPU that powered many video games, the Motorola 68000. From its inception and launch in the late 70s, the Motorola 68000 CPU brought power and performance to programmers that they had never witnessed before. It would not only power an entire generation of video games from the mid-80s to the late 90s, it was many more times powerful than its competition at the time, and its legacy would span across 15 years. Depending on who you ask, the Motorola 68000 could be considered a 16-bit or a 32-bit processor, with compelling arguments for either, and we'll talk about those a little bit later, but ultimately it doesn't really matter. While originally expensive to manufacture, the 68000 became more affordable and found its way into consumer electronics and powered many a 16-bit home computer, including the Amiga, the Atari ST, the Sharp X68000, the Apple Macintosh, and even the ill-fated Sinclair QL used a variant of the 68000 processor. By the 90s, it would find its way into game consoles such as the Sega Genesis, Neo Geo AES, even the Atari Jaguar and Sega Saturn. However, in this instance, the processor is not the main central point of the hardware. Rather, the chip acts as a coprocessor. On the Jag, it opens up the possibilities from ports from the Atari ST and the Commodore Amiga, as the chip can be used for game logic. On the Sega Saturn, the 68000 manages audio processing and other I/O tasks. However, it's no coincidence that the Saturn is also capable of running Sega Wideboard ports from the arcade, such as Power Drift, in its full superscalar glory.
Get ready.
Many arcade games of the era used one, or sometimes more than one 68000 to power their games, and we're talking about some of the very best in video game history, including Outrun, Super Hang-On, Afterburner, and the entire Street Fighter II and Alpha series. With an estimated 4,000 arcade games being powered by a 68000, its legacy is incredible. Simply put, it was the heart of an entire generation of video games.
Rocket launcher.
The origins of the 68K go all the way back to the 70s, where Motorola had developed their first widely produced processor, the 6800. This 8-bit chip was a steady seller, but it was eclipsed by more popular and cheaper 8-bit chips of the time, such as the Zilog Z80 and the MOS 6502. Fortunately, Motorola had a large contract with General Motors for 6800s installed in engine control modules, which made them cash rich. However, aside from this, the sales book for the 6800 was flat. With the sales pipeline of the 6800 dwindling, Motorola considered their options. With the emergence of 16-bit CPUs such as the Intel 8086 and a rumored 16-bit Z80 processor, Motorola knew that they had to compete. But their chip couldn't just be 10% faster than the 8086. It needed to be at least twice as fast at the same cost. Furthermore, it wouldn't just be another 16-bit design, it needed to incorporate some 32-bit features. Engineering samples of the 68K chip were released in 1979. By 1981, the chip would be available over the counter, with clock speeds up to 8 MHz supported. This was bleeding edge for the time. However, the price per unit was around $470, and its early adoption was largely in Unix workstations. But the 68K started to become more popular in the arcades as they started to transition into a 16-bit market. Food Fight from Atari, and Libble Rabble from Namco were some of the earliest arcade games to use the 68K processor in 1983. And because of the power and the versatility of the chip, Sega would use the processor in its arcade line by 1985 with the release of Hang On. This was the first in the Sega Superscaler series of three-dimensional arcade games. At the time of release, this was the most powerful arcade hardware in the world that featured two 68K processors on board. By 1986, the Hang On hardware was upgraded to what is known as the Outrun arcade hardware, which of course powers one of the very best arcade racing games ever created. This hardware would also power other classic games such as Super Hang On, and once again powered by dual 68Ks with both processors clocked at an almost unheard of 12.5 MHz for the time. Coupled with the dedicated Superscaler video hardware, it was a transformative moment in arcade gaming. Sega would follow up with updates to their Superscaler and System 16 arcade hardware, with the final iteration, the Sega Y-board hardware, contained three 68K processors on board to orchestrate the gameplay experience. The gap between the games you could play in the arcade and what would be available in the home was high, but because of the fast advancements in processor technology, it meant that the price of the 68K chip had decreased significantly. It became a much more desired chip, not only in the arcades, but in home computing. Motorola would become a long-term supplier of 68K processors with the Apple Lisa and the Apple Macintosh line of computers. But it wouldn't be until the Amiga computer that originally launched in 1985 that really put the 68000 on the map. Jay Miner, the father of the Amiga, had a goal to create a computer, specifically a 16 or 32-bit system, which centered around the 68000 processor. He envisaged that this computer would have the power and capabilities to drive advanced graphics and sound, and the chip would be the central element of the Amiga.
The early choice of the 68000 microprocessor was very important to the Amiga as a personal computer. This choice has helped to give the Amiga superior computing power and has allowed continuous user upgrades.
It orchestrated an architecture where the CPU could efficiently be used to control and manipulate graphics and sound with incredible results. But it was all thanks to the 68000 and the Amiga's innovative architecture driven by Jay Miner's vision, which had a significant impact on the computer industry and video game development. Capcom would also migrate to the 68000 processor originally in 1987 for their Capcom Play System hardware. This powered many classic arcade games, including the mighty Street Fighter II and its many iterations. Due to rampant piracy and bootlegging, Capcom would move then to the more advanced CPS2 hardware, but they would still retain the same 68K processor all the way up until December of 2003, with Hyper Street Fighter II being the final game releasing for the hardware. But let's pause here for the moment and try to understand what made the 68K CPU so good. When we consider how fast technology advances these days, it's unheard of for a single processor to stay relevant in the home, arcade, and console space for that amount of time. We're talking over 15 years. The Motorola 68K was a versatile and powerful chip that programmers love to develop on. But let's get into some more detail about why this is the case. The number of bits that a CPU is determined by is generally agreed upon to be the width of the bus, that is, the size in bits that connects the CPU to its memory and other chips on the motherboard. The Motorola 68000 does have a 16-bit data bus, so most agree that it's a 16-bit chip. Sega themselves marketed the Sega Genesis as a 16-bit system, but the story doesn't end quite there. Let's consider, for example, how a CPU could perform simple math. If we looked at a scenario where a simple program wants to add two numbers that are stored somewhere in memory, the CPU must retrieve the first number from memory, then the second number from memory, then perform an addition. The retrieval of these values from memory are stored into what is known as registers. They are small, high-speed memory locations inside the CPU used to store data and instructions that are frequently accessed or manipulated by the CPU during processing. They act as a temporary holding area for the information the CPU needs to execute operations, making it many times more faster than accessing data from main memory. So then, let's look at this example of adding two numbers. The 68K move instruction is taking the value of X, which sits somewhere in memory, and stores it in D1, which is a data register on the 68K. And the next line retrieves the value of Y from memory and stores it in DO, which is another data register. Then the next line performs the addition, which stores the addition result in D0. Then this final step moves the addition result back into memory in the result variable. Now, even if you don't follow assembly language, this should be pretty straightforward. DO and D1 are data registers found on the 68K. These are the fastest possible areas, as we said, where data can be retrieved from. Generally speaking, retrieving data from system memory is many more times slower than accessing data from registers. Before the Motorola 68K, registers were limited to just a handful, but the 68K changed all that. It came with 16 programmable registers. Each of these are 32 bits wide. In comparison, the 68K's biggest rival, the Intel 8086, had just 8 16-bit registers. You can start to understand the flexibility that programmers were offered to build their code on. The internal 32-bit nature of the 68000 meant that it could process data in larger chunks, enabling faster and more efficient computation. But to reduce cost and maintain compatibility with 16-bit peripherals, it featured a 16-bit external data bus, as we mentioned, but its address bus would be 24 bits. This meant that it could address memory up to 16 megabytes in size. This was a massive amount for the era. Not only could home computers scale accordingly with extra memory being added, in the arcades, larger games were possible on the 68K thanks to the massive slab of memory that was available without resorting to bank switching. And rather than look back, Motorola designed the 68000 to be forward compatible. The chip and its architecture were built to cater to emerging multitasking operating systems and complex applications and video games. This forward-thinking philosophy ensured that the 68000 remained relevant and influential for years after its release, and full 32-bit enhanced versions of the 68000 chip, including the 68020 all the way up to the 68060, would offer significantly faster speeds and a wider 32-bit bus without resorting to any compromises. Other important features of the processor was its orthogonal instruction set. In other words, every single instruction that we saw on the 68K can be run against every single register, which means it makes it easier for programmers to write their own algorithms. The processor can also perform 32-bit addition in 6 CPU cycles. This means that programmers can implement things like smooth scrolling using far less code. And finally, the 68000 supports direct memory mapping. Now, if you compare that to the Intel 8086, which used segmented addressing and page tables, this was a much more desirable solution. And ultimately, it was just so damn cool to code on. Developers loved the 68000. Its clean, consistent instruction set and powerful addressing modes is amongst the favorites of many software developers. The DemoScene especially embraced the Motorola 68000 on both the Amiga and the ST, with incredible demonstrations of heavily optimized code that runs on just 7 MHz stock machines. And to this day, there's still an annual demo party called 68K Inside that's hosted in Finland, which is a celebration of the Motorola 68000 CPU and its derivatives. Demos can be developed on any and all 68-based machines and consoles. Now we know that the 68K was great at running video games, but it also powered the home computer GUI revolution. In 1985, the Amiga came standard with its own graphical operating system called Workbench. It came standard on a single floppy disk and ran extremely fast in just 512 kilobytes of RAM. It handled all the OS level tasks and even included a command line shell. But what was most impressive was the speed and responsiveness of the OS. Of course, the custom Blitter hardware was great at moving data around the screen very quickly, but its speed and performance with its multitasking was unheard of. The Macintosh came with its own operating system known as Mac OS, the very popular GUI that Apple is still very much using to this day. The Atari ST used GEM, which is built into the ROM chips of the hardware, and was also a very fast GUI that could handle many powerful applications such as Cubase. The Sharp X68000, the Japanese 68,000 base machine, was very popular for arcade gaming. It came with two different graphical operating systems that were both powered by the processor. And the common theme between all these GUIs that were available on various home computers is that they all had the ability to scale as more memory and more processing power was added. By the 90s, game consoles were incorporating the 68,000 in their hardware. The price of the 68,000 chip was an estimated $15 per unit. The Sega Genesis would be the first home console to use the processor, and it showed Sega's commitment to their home console division. The Genesis saw many faithful ports from arcade games, which all used the very same processor. The Neo Geo home console, the AES, contained the exact same 68,000 based hardware that was found in its arcade equivalent known as the MVS. And you would have to pay for the privilege. The price of the home console was not cheap, and the games were expensive. But what you got was arcade perfection, literally. Because of the flexible flat memory map of the 68,000 processor, SNK designed large games suitable for the arcades and made it a selling point. You can see this proudly displayed on many of the game cartridges. We're talking about the largest video games on a single cartridge, eclipsing anything that the Super NES or Genesis was capable of at the time. Motorola would discontinue the 68,000 processor in 1996, but it wouldn't be quite the end of the story. In the arcades, the IGS PGM, short for Polygame Master, was a lesser-known arcade hardware that was one of the last arcade boards to ever feature a 68,000 chip. The hardware was released in 1997, 20 years after the launch of the 68K, and it was clocked at 20 MHz. While it wasn't exclusively powered by a 68K, many games would contain an add-on ARM7 processor. It was for all intents and purposes a cheaper system to compete with the Neo Geo MVS. The IGS PGM powered many 2D fighting games, shmups, and 2D side-scrolling brawlers, and if you consider by 1997, arcades had well and truly moved to 3D, with games like Daytona USA, Virtua Fighter 3, and Tekken 3. It may have sounded like the hardware was destined to fail, but it had its place. It was cheap, and even convinced Cave, who worked on many 68K based shmups in the early 90s, to return to making arcade games, and they did so in a big way. Over time, however, the Motorola 68,000 became obsolete. Many people have their own thoughts and opinions about why this is the case, but for me, growing up with an Amiga in the household, Motorola simply fell off the cutting edge. It felt like they were always playing catch up with Intel in the chip wars. The 68040 and 060, while fast, were far more expensive than a 486 or a Pentium chip of the time, and arguably weren't as powerful. Take for example the 68060 accelerator board for my Amiga 1200 here. It cost me about $800 when I purchased it for this board alone. The Mac, Amiga, and Atari ST all ran different operating systems, and unfortunately, there was no unified software base outside of emulation. And there would be no sustained demand for the chip, and ultimately it lost in the chip wars to the x86. By 1991, the Apple-IBM Motorola alliance was created to compete with Windows and the Intel market. Out of this appeared the IBM's Power Architecture and the creation of the PowerPC instruction set, which would be Apple's next generation of Macintosh line of computers. The PowerPC architecture would ultimately find its way into the Xbox 360, Sony PlayStation 3, the Nintendo GameCube, and the Nintendo Wii. But the 68,000 has never really gone away. It's still being used in various embedded systems, hobbyist hardware projects, and of course many homebrew games and ports. Even Workbench, the Amiga 68K based operating system, just saw an official update recently, and of course the demo scene continues on. Many coders that I've spoken to over the years continue to say that it's their favorite architecture to write on due to its flexibility and power. This single chip powered an entire generation of games across the home computer, console, and arcade mediums for years, and its legacy is truly something special. Bye for now.